This leadership diagnostic is a way of working out how people in the line contributed to any given exception or problem. The method is based on an understanding that there's fundamentally a difference between what one gets and what one gives. And this difference, first of all, relates to how we understand the relationship between cause and effect. Cause is what you do, it's what sits in your hands. The effect is what sits outside of your hands and happens over a period of time. That therefore means it's also consistent with the distinction between outcome and process. Process is concerned with what you do, and outcome is concerned with the effect over time. And that therefore means you can describe contribution as what you do and result as the effect over time. Now, we've come to use this distinction to understand the difference between responsibility and accountability. Our view is that accountability of the two words is the harder word. I mean, this is the thing you will carry consequences for. Whereas responsibility is a bigger kind of idea that really describes an area that you have a custodial sort of charge over. So we would add to our distinction so far the idea that accountability is concerned with what sits in your own hands, and responsibility is concerned with the outcome or the results that you get over a period of time. Our view, therefore, is that fundamentally what you get from the world is not actually in your control. It doesn't sit in your hands. But what sits in your hands, what you have control over, is what you give to the world. It is the causal bits, the process bits, the contribution you make, that is your accountability. Now, using this insight on a hypothetical sort of three-level hierarchy, let us say, for instance, we're dealing with a worker, and the worker produces a result, that's true, on the basis of what the worker does, but the result doesn't happen by magic. The worker does certain things to produce that result. He does a certain task to stand it. And using the distinction we've just alluded to, we would say that the result is the worker's responsibility, it's what he gets, but the worker's accountability is to do the job that he's supposed to do to stand it. Let's assume this worker reports to a supervisor or an overseer. And the first question is, well, is there a result that's concerned with what the overseer does? And yes, there normally would be, and that result would be a bigger one than the worker's result because it will be a cumulative result of all the workers in his area. The issue is, what does the overseer himself give with regard to those results? And first of all, the overseer might be doing certain tasks himself. I mean, he might be doing a report for his boss. He might be sitting in on a job grading committee, all sorts of tasks he might be doing himself. But the rest of what he does gets delivered for him through the worker. And the question is, what's the overseer's contribution with regard to what gets done through the worker? And clearly, that contribution is to care for the worker, to look after the worker, and to give the worker the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what the worker is required to do. So the overseer's contribution, the overseer's accountability is to do certain tasks himself and to provide the worker with care, means, and ability and accountability. The result is the overseer's responsibility. And so then we obviously would have a similar logic when we examine the boss. The boss also produces a result. Some of the tasks that the boss gives or does are actually she would do herself. Then, similarly to the overseer, there might be sort of a longer term plan that she would have to present to her board or whatever. But the rest of what she does gets delivered through the overseer. Her contribution with regard to what gets delivered through the overseer is to care for the overseer, to give him the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him. So we could therefore say that the boss's accountability is to do some tasks and to provide care, means, ability, and accountability for the overseer, and the boss's responsibility is to achieve a result. So let's assume there's been some result that's really completely out of whack, and let's assume that the reason for that being the case is that the worker didn't do certain things to stand it. Now, in most organizations, the boss's response to this would be just make damn sure this never happens again, which is really a controlled response. And this is clearly an inappropriate way for the boss to deal with this, because the boss has to recognize that she herself has made a contribution to this problem. So the question is, well, what is the boss's contribution? And actually, you cannot work out what the boss's contribution to the particular problem was until you've worked out what the overseer's contribution was. And you cannot work out how the overseer contributed to the problem until you've worked out how the worker contributed to the problem. So you actually need to establish how each level in the hierarchy contributes to a problem bottom up. So if we applied it to this instance, let's assume that the reason why the worker didn't do what's required of him because he was just plain careless. And so therefore, what needs to happen is that the overseer should discipline the worker. But let's assume the overseer doesn't know how to discipline the worker. Well, then what the boss should do is basically train the overseer to be able to discipline. So if we constructed this problem bottom up, we would then notice then that how each person contributed to this issue that went wrong is that, first of all, the worker was careless. Secondly, the overseer didn't hold the worker accountable. And thirdly, the boss's contribution was not to enable the overseer to discipline the worker. The critical point about this is for the boss to do anything other than to enable the overseer to discipline, in this instance, would actually need to fix the problem cosmetically. It's not good enough for her to intervene, to impose a control mechanism just to get the worker to do the thing right. We have this leadership diagnostic methodology that actually is concerned with unpacking a problem like this. And let's apply the method to this particular example. Now, the leadership diagnostic methodology has two sort of instruments that's associated. The first is a form where you're required to work out what went wrong where the tire hit the road. And so in this case, we're asking ourselves, who did what to cause the exception? Now, what you've got to understand when you do a job like this is that sometimes there's more than one root cause to the exception. I mean, maybe the worker was careless, but also at the same time, they weren't given the right information to do the job properly. There might have been a number of conspiring reasons to the person's not performing the task to standard. Also, if there's more than one root cause, you need to do an independent leadership diagnostic on each cause separately. But because we're just exercising now, and we're going to assume that in this instance, there's only one cause, and the cause is that the worker didn't do the job to standard, or the job that was done wasn't completed to standard. And so the first question is, well, who did not complete the task to standard? Clearly, it was the worker. And so, well, why didn't the worker complete the task to standard? Now, there's a multiple choice here. I mean, was it a means issue or an ability issue? And if not, they should be censured or punished. So let's assume that in this case, it was an accountability issue. So the person needs to be censured. So what the person needs specifically is the worker should have been warned for having been negligent in completing the task. And the person who should have warned the worker obviously would have been the overseer. And we did say, or did the overseer do this? No, the overseer didn't do it because the overseer wasn't able to do it. So the overseer needs training on how to run a disciplinary inquiry. Was the overseer trained on how to run a disciplinary inquiry? No, they weren't. Why? Because the boss hadn't taught them how to run a disciplinary inquiry. So what's important about the leadership diagnostic methodology is that it helps each person in the line to work out how they personally contributed to the problem. Let's assume that the boss is the person who actually used this format in order to deal with the thing that went wrong, this poor result based on somebody having not done the task accordingly. What the format allows them to do is unpack the contribution that they should be making, rather than just imposing another control. So Let's have a further example, and this time a mining example. So let's assume that the exception that we're dealing with is a poor face advance. And the reason why there's a poor face advance is that the RDO doesn't move the drill. The RDO, being the rock drill operator, doesn't move the drill to standard. There's a particular standard of the drill having to be perpendicular to the face in order to get the right pattern of blast. What very often happens on a deep level mine is a rock drill operator would, rather than move the drill every time he drills a hole so that he can stay perpendicular to the face, he would drill the first hole at an angle to the right. He would then drill the second hole straight, and the third hole at an angle to the left, which means he doesn't have to move the drill that frequently. So there's a definite standard whereby the drill should be moved, and the drill should ideally be moved with every hole. Now let's assume he didn't do that. He doesn't drill to standard because he doesn't move the drill frequently enough. Why? Let's assume in this instance the RDO is careless. He has been trained. He knows how to do it. The RDO should be censured for not having drilled to standard. Who should censure the RDO? Clearly, it would be the miner. The miner should do that. The miner is the RDO's boss. Let's assume that the miner didn't discipline the RDO because the miner doesn't know how to discipline somebody. And so, in other words, our problem has changed. We're not actually dealing with the fact that the RDO doesn't drill to standard. We're dealing with the fact that the miner doesn't discipline RDOs. And the reason why the miner doesn't discipline RDO, the question is, well, why is this? Is the means issue, an ability issue, and accountability issue? Well, the reason why he doesn't discipline them is because he doesn't know how to. And the person who the miner reports to is the shift boss. So clearly what the shift boss should be doing is the shift boss should be training the miner how to discipline an RDO. And let's assume that the shift boss hasn't been doing that, because, well, why hasn't the shift boss been training the miner to discipline RDOs? Well, actually, it's not been required of him. The mine overseer who he reports to hasn't made it clear to him that his deliverable for the mine is miners who discipline. So this means that, in fact, from the shift boss's point of view, this is a means problem. He's not been given a clear standard to cultivate miners who discipline. So the question is, well, why does the mine overseer not require the shift boss to enable miners who discipline? This is, again, a means issue, similar to what it is with the shift boss. The mine overseer doesn't have a clear deliverable that says that all these shift bosses must train miners to discipline, which basically means to say we are now concerned with the contribution that the manager is making to this problem. And what we discover is that the manager's view of the whole matter of discipline is that it's an HR issue. He doesn't see it as a line problem. So what we're suggesting is that it doesn't help trying to deal with this issue of the RDO not moving the drill to standard at this level, because actually this is purely a symptom. The real cause sits much higher in the hierarchy, where the manager doesn't feel that discipline is actually a problem that should sit in the line, and that training people to discipline and enabling people to discipline and holding people accountable, line people accountable for disciplining, that this should sit in the line. Our leadership diagnostic instrument, therefore, has these two elements to it. It has a first page which requires you to work out what exactly went wrong, what were the root causes to the problem, and then each one of those root causes, each one of those specific causes, you would do an independent leadership diagnostic on.